So we are hoping everything is going to come up now. I'm just kind of checking the feed here. It should be coming up. Online. Good. Let me check it on there. Great. We're good. We're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Sorry we are behind. That's just sometimes how life goes. But here we are. How you doing, John?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Phil?
Oh, I'm fine. I hurt my back this week, so I'm uncomfortable, but I'm going forward.
Yeah. Tell us about your back. I want to hear. So you said that it's just anytime you sleep on something weird, right?
Yeah, at least that's been the consistent thing I've discovered is it's this lower back, and I think it's a nerve because I lose my ability to like walk right. And it's just really painful. But the last 3 times it's happened, 2 of them were on vacation, and one of them was this past week when we did a garage sale, and I didn't want to bring everything inside because it was so much stuff. So we would just put it on the porch, and then I slept on the couch next to the windows because I just felt weird, like sleeping upstairs with all of our stuff outside. And so I think that did it, unfortunately. I know.
That's so terrible.
I'm getting old. That's the problem.
There's no other reason why you were being made to sleep on the couch.
No, right. Thankfully, no.
Okay, good.
Oh my goodness.
It wasn't because of something that you said on Stump the Pastor last week.
No, I hope not.
Okay, that's good. Oh, look, you're drinking water. I'm drinking coffee. Ooh, look at that. I didn't even notice that. Look at that. The camera just showed me. I have a big chocolate run down the side of my coffee.
You should have just said it's part of the cup's design.
Yeah, I don't think you can pull that off with IKEA stuff. IKEA stuff is very plain.
Yeah. Oh, man. All right, well, guys, welcome. Please do feel free to drop us any questions you may have down in the comments. We do have one question that we put off for a couple of weeks, not because we didn't want to deal with it, but just because lots of other stuff kept coming up. But that's good. That means people are interested and we'll keep going. So please do drop a comment in the chat and we will get to it. Welcome, Carolyn and Jane and whoever else may be here. Let us know you're here. It doesn't show us absolutely everyone is here.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. So we do our best to respond to questions that we get ahead of time in the week, but we do prioritize questions that are live. So if you're a person who can watch live, if you're watching this later, and you can watch live and you have a question, that's going to be your best way of getting that to us is to ask that live, because then first of all, it's more stumpy. We don't have time to research and things like that. So you have more of an opportunity. But also, we are going to respond to those questions because the people are able to actively participate with us. So I think that's kind of been our method, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I like it that way.
So that just means that sometimes we're going to get to questions 3 weeks after we get them. But,
It's all good. No one has anywhere to go, right? So...
That's right.
What is time?
And if you were going to school, it's likely that your school has already been indefinitely postponed. So
sent back home. Oh my goodness.
You've already been returned. Hey, Phil, I'm really excited that we as a church have not had an outbreak yet. Knock on wood here, but maybe schools should have just been hosting classes in the parking lot. I think that's going to be my recommendation to schools.
Can you imagine the absolute chaos?
That would be so fun.
Oh my gosh.
Like just in like little pods, just like taped off.
That's how it is in Africa, man. There's just people like outside, and they're just like on the side of the building and like other places.
Yeah. I remember.
Yeah.
Did you know that I went to Africa?
When did you go?
I went to Africa in 2009 and helped teach basic like PC functions to high school students.
Oh, nice.
But we also rebuilt a school in I'm forgetting the name of it's a town, just a small village outside of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and the capital city of Ethiopia.
Nice.
But it was really great. I was only there for 10 days. I'm not a big short-term missions guy, but in this case, we were going to serve a school that the company and the church that I was at so this is how it is, right, in the church. Everybody from the company also went to the church. So when we did a mission trip, it was like the company, but also the church. So it was like everybody from the company, but also the pastor came. So like that, a lot of the people from the company had a long existing relationship. So, but I did teach. At one point I did teach quadratic functions to an advanced math class. It was fun. They were like, you should just stay here and be a teacher. And I was like 17 at the time, and I was like, yes. My parents were like, you're going home.
Yeah.
But I hadn't eaten anything without. This is a strange thing. They put curry in all their Western food in Ethiopia. So I hadn't eaten anything without curry, and it was starting to affect my bowels. So.
Stump the pastor, friends. What can you do? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No, that's cool, man. I had no idea about that.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump into a question that came a few weeks ago, and it was we had been talking about the protests and kind of injustice and such, and the question was posed: how would you view the conquest of Canaan in the light of your current view of oppression and oppressed people? And I think it was also in reference, as you informed me, and I then read Don Wagner's article, which is at orlandhope.org on the blog. So I'll let you I know you originally kind of made that connection. So
yeah. So the conquest of Canaan is one of these. Okay. So I'll put it this way. I am very hesitant as a pastor of a majority culture suburban white church in the most powerful nation, basically in the history of the world, right? So, like, I think that you could argue at different times there have been powers that have been more dominant than the United States is today. For example, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire. But as far as sheer power and economic ability to affect the rest of the world, the United States is overwhelmingly the empire of the world today. I think that being in a culture where we are most of us in the suburbs of Chicago are in the top, 10, 20% of the country that is the number one most powerful country, perhaps in the history of the world. I think it's very, very dangerous to read the book of Joshua and see yourself in any role that Joshua's people who will call the Israelites occupied in that story. The entire Joshua narrative is about the oppressed people of Israel going into the land. Now, even that said, so first of all, any sort of conquest, militarized ideology that we bring, well, we're going to go in, like Joshua's people went into Canaan, we will go into the Middle East. That type of ideology is super problematic, and I don't subscribe to that in any way. But even looking at it from the perspective of oppressed people, the conquest of Canaan, it's really the story of how, and I'm treading super lightly here. It's either that we fundamentally misunderstand what actually happened, and I can provide context for why I think that could be the case, or that, and this is the Don Wagner, the person he referenced, or this is not God ordained activity in Canaan. This is a cautionary tale about what happens when people have been systematically oppressed for generations and then they rise into power. And I think that you can make, hurt people, that type of thing. Enslaved people, enslave people. Oppressed people, oppress people. Abused people, abuse people. Right? Like you can understand this from that perspective as well. So those are the two. Either we fundamentally just do not understand the way that the language is used in the book of Joshua, or or it's a cautionary tale about something that wasn't necessarily God's. Even if it was God ordained, it was not God sanctioned, right? So those can be like different. Everything is God ordained because God has control over the universe, but not everything is God sanctioned. Not all things are God saying this. I'm putting my stamp of approval on this. And I'll end with one other thing, and that's before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of either of those, which is that Elie Wiesel, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, who has a problematic relationship with the nation of Israel until his death. So I'm not saying he is the end-all be-all as far as moral authority, but he certainly survived the horrors of the Holocaust in the Auschwitz concentration camp. When somebody asked him at a seminar, how can you justify the genocide of Canaan or the conquest of Canaan in the Bible? He says, in the book of Joshua is the only book in the Old Testament in which singing is not present. Namely, that the people who are doing this hated themselves for doing this. No one celebrates anywhere in the book of Joshua. Even over great military victories, nobody celebrates because it's not to be celebrated. And that, that I think that carries some weight too. And I did some research into that. He's right. It's the only place in the entire Bible where nobody sings at any point in the entire book. And it's a long book. It's not like Jude. It's just not mentioned or something. Like no. It's really this is a primary issue that happens. So I think that's a convoluted understanding, but I have never preached out of the book of Joshua to my knowledge. I may have referenced something that happens in Joshua, but the entire book of Joshua is incredibly problematic to me.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And I think, sometimes I think in these conversations, we aren't always trying to provide like an exact answer of go forth and view it this way, but hopefully some wrestling. And so I think for both of us, probably we are ourselves continually wrestling with stories like these. And I think that's important to recognize. And this is just a plug for Hope Covenant in general. But, I do go back to the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, the God, however you sort of read that story of the wrestling. And he says, I'm not going to let you go till you bless me, right? And I feel sometimes that we have to do that with passages. And that wrestling may go on for years or decades. And during the wrestling, we may have to say, hey, this is kind of my adversary right now. And I'm not letting go and running away, but I'm also not just saying, hey, let's just be friends and forget the fact that we're in a wrestling match. And I think this is one of those books where, and I sometimes wonder if that's the purpose, too, of God doesn't want us just to settle and say, I've got it figured out. God somewhat wants us just to stay in the ring and fight through those issues, because in doing so, we figure out how to apply it. So we may never come to a point where we say, I absolutely get this. But because we're in the ring wrestling, when something happens in Israel-Palestine, or when something happens with Black Lives Matter, or when an oppressed person comes out from oppression, we may be able to look at the book of Joshua and use it as a means to love, even if we don't have it figured out. If that all sort of makes sense, because I think in everything you said, there's already a number of things we can say, ooh, let me view how I look at the Middle East differently. Let me consider what it's like for someone in the Black Lives Matter, a black person experiencing it, if that sort of makes sense. So I think right off the bat, we can say, let's continue to wrestle with it. But with that sort, so I think that's a good place to be. And I think if we just leave people there, that is absolutely great. But I would say when it comes to the book of Joshua, I think number one, you were spot on with the idea of let's be careful who we view ourselves as in the story, because, we are not Israel in this part of the story, because we have not come out of Egypt. We are not traveling to a new land. And so to say, let's now use it, well, we are not there. And so we need to be careful how we use it. But what I would say just about the conquest in general is and people know this, and some people would have a serious problem with this, but I like to play with the text. And by play, I mean play and remake the rules sometimes, because I think that that's what our tradition actually invites us to do. Now, that doesn't mean there's no rules. It doesn't mean there's no bounds. Like, I still see loving God and loving others and history, all those things is important. But, when I look at the book of Joshua, I'm just not sure that the violence is actually what happened as how we sometimes read it. So, for example, Israel clearly did not go in and just kill everyone. So even if there's passages that seem to say God told us to go and do this, well, they saved Rahab. They didn't kill Rahab because Rahab made peace with them. They made peace with other groups. And it almost appears too, I'd have to look up the exact verse. I think it's Joshua. Here, I'm going to look it up just really quick. Joshua chapter 11, verse 19 and 20 says, oh, that's not the right verse, so never mind. But it does seem to me that they did at least try to make peace with some groups. And so the idea that they actually did just go in and like kill everyone, it's not what happened. And it actually seems that they were open to working with some people. And then when they do fight with a city, it's not clear to me that we have to interpret it that they killed any non-combatants. Like, the way the passages go, yeah. I don't believe we have to believe that, I don't think this was a genocide. I think the people they fought with were the people who said, no, we're not okay with you coming here. We're going to fight and kill you. And so a fight ensued. Now, that's a separate conversation of was that okay or not? But again, this was a group of immigrants who had no home, who were coming into a land. And if a group of people said, no, we won't make peace with you, we're going to kill you, we're no longer talking about genocide, right? We're actually talking about something different. And so in the way that I at least see it, I think peace was possible. I don't think women and children were killed. And I think the fighting may have reflected some other things rather than, hey, we're just coming in and killing you. So I think there's a way to read it that doesn't require them just coming in, burning down villages, regardless of who the people were or if they were okay with them being there.
Well, and I think that this is something that I think that people ought to be extremely careful. So the book of Joshua, if I was going to teach anything about the book of Joshua, I'd probably teach the entire book of Joshua, other than perhaps the Rahab story. That's the Rahab story kind of stands on its own as like a story of it's a different reading. When Rahab is the hero, you have a totally different reading of the text in Joshua. But anyway,
that I think allows us to review the whole thing because of that story.
No, totally. So I think that you have to be equally careful with. So here, first thing, just to your point, if you read any two chapters of Joshua, they will contradict two consecutive or concurrent chapters. They contradict each other. Almost automatically.
They took a city. They didn't take a city. This happened. They destroyed everything. They didn't destroy
everything. They utterly destroyed everyone in their path. They didn't actually fight with these people at all. Well, they killed everyone in this village. Well, actually, they didn't actually kill most of the people in this village. Right? So, like, that's how the book of Joshua
Which is what archaeology seems to show as well, right? It doesn't seem to show a whole bunch of people getting wiped out and Israel just moving in.
Right. It's all right. And I mean, just take the Philistines, for example, that then subsequently the Israelites are dealing with until the rise of the Babylonians. When the Babylonians become the Philistines become Babylonians, right? Like the rise of the Philistines, what Philistines would have been there? I thought that we eviscerated all the Philistines. I thought that we genocided the Philistines. Why were they still around, right? So clearly that reading the text in that way is not necessary or helpful. However, I often see the book of Joshua as a justification for God's conquest of the world and a militarized, which tends to be, and I'm going to say this very carefully, it tends to be a more conservative viewpoint as it pertains to law and order type of mentality. We have to go in and so whenever a conservative person or person who leans more toward military interventions for that purpose comes to me and gives me that interpretation, I like to fire back at them that if you read Joshua as many modern interpreters read Joshua, It is perhaps the most Marxist, socialist, radicalist book in the entire canon. And that's because if you read city, so the word city, it has no ancient meaning, right? Like we don't actually, like think about it from the perspective of like urbanization. We think of cities as having very clearly defined borders. But in reality, ancient cities don't have clearly defined borders. That was one of the things that really distinguished and differentiated Jerusalem, is that it had a clearly defined border. Cities were kind of sprawling farmlands, right? And so when you say the thing city, are you talking about everyone who's within a trade environment? So you're talking about farmers that live literally 30 miles outside of the city? Or are you talking about a clearly defined group, in which case probably the proper terminology would be citadel. So now, and this really comes into play when you talk about the conquest of Jericho, and I'm going to really shock people, right? So like ancient authors or ancient historians report that Jericho had no wall around the entire cityscape. So around the farm, Jericho did not protect its farms, in other words. So there was no wall around all of the people of Jericho. There was, however, a wall in Jericho. It was around what they called the polis, or the elite. So the people who were the proletariat or the top class, right? Like the top people, the people who were land owning, slave owning, we'll just call it the rich, right? The people who lived in the Gold Coast or the Hinsdale, or I mean, you take your pick, Wilmette. These were the people who had a wall, and their wall was not only to protect them from foreign invaders; it was to protect them from their own farmers. And so here's where it gets really tricky, right? So when we think about the conquest of Canaan as the conquest of citadels instead of the conquest of cities, and I'm not saying this is the way you have to interpret it. Then what you have instead is that the highly militarized people who are holding all of the wealth were the people that Joshua was going in and overthrowing, not the poor farmers on the outskirts being murdered for no reason. And you also have to deal with the fact that those were highly militarized, while the Israelites were not highly militarized and didn't have a lot of people. And so you go, especially when the way that you're interpreting Exodus was much smaller than how it's
3
portrayed,
million
right?
people or something like that. Yeah, 2 million.
Right. So if Exodus is really only in the thousands, then there's no way that Israel can amass an army that could siege one of those citadels.
Yeah, those walls. Yeah, ancient walls were like just to try and keep people out. Like you couldn't just overthrow them with a few people.
Right. So then what you have instead is that Joshua is not a young military leader. Joshua is a young revolutionary who goes to the people in the surrounding and says, it is unfair that you are being economically oppressed by the capitalists who live inside the walls, and he recruits the farmers from the city to overthrow their own rulers.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
And when you interpret it from that perspective, you wind up with a staunchly anti-capitalist reading of Joshua. And I'm not saying that you should interpret it that way. I'm just saying that before you go out and use the text as a bludgeon, understand that there are people who can use the text as a bludgeon and bludgeon you right back with it. Which is why I think it's important that we're very careful and that we say that we're willing to play with the text. Because, by the way, I can do that with basically any text in the Bible. Any text that you interpret as, this is a radically liberal text, I could show you how that's a radically conservative text. This is a radically conservative text. I can show you how that is a radically liberal text. And that is why we serve the party of the sheep and not the party of the donkey or the elephant. Because ultimately this is the great, you know what I mean? This is the great heresy of our political system.
I like that, man. We need like a Banksy photo that shows both of them with like a bloodied sheep in the middle and be like, I serve the sheep.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the truth. Right now, if you watch certain news networks, they will tell you that supporting Joe Biden means the end of Christianity as we know it. Supporting a Christian, a Catholic, is the end of Christianity as we know it. The other news networks will say that supporting Donald Trump, who has evangelical support almost on lock, is the end of Christianity as we know it. anyone who's trying to shove down your throat that supporting one of the political parties is unchristian or is the only Christian way is lying to you. Because all of these texts can be interpreted both, from conservative perspectives to liberal perspectives. So that when you get into the conquest of Canaan, I think it's an especially interesting text to play with because you do have these underlying kind of very liberal, almost, Castro or, Che Guevara type undertones to Joshua's rise. And that you wind up with a much more averse. Most of the people who like to talk about Joshua would be very uncomfortable with that translation.
But I like that, and I don't even know that maybe it's helpful to compare it to a real person. I would just say, which one is more in line with the life of Jesus? Like, which one shows us how to love God and love others more? And I think that would jive a lot more with the tradition. See, like, that is a lot less problematic because, again, they're not killing innocent people. And there's an invitation of those behind the wall to open the gate. And then they don't have to die. There doesn't need to be a fight. And that, to me, Scripture interpreting Scripture, right? The idea of, again, I don't believe that the Bible ever contradicts itself, which you're going to laugh at me because I view contradiction differently than, historically, scientifically, whatever. I view it as loving God and loving others. And I would say it doesn't contradict itself when we understand the nature of revealing God and revealing who we are. So with something...
I would agree.
What's that?
I would agree with that. I would say that Scripture doesn't contradict itself because Scripture, that's like saying that math and colors contradict each other.
Or that my own story contradicts itself. Well, it's my story. I don't know how it would contradict itself. But I do think parts of my story can help me better understand other parts. And so I think Joshua can be better understood when, as you started bringing in Jesus and these other things. So one of the big things in Joshua is harem, right? The dedicated things that were dedicated to God that Israel wasn't meant to touch. Well, these are things that were idolatrous, right? These were things where people were worshiping other gods or were becoming like gods themselves and oppressing other people. And God is basically saying, when you go into the land, I want you to destroy all the stuff that causes people to worship anything other than me. And we might think, well, geez, this God then is just all about himself. Well, but again, if we know that God is all about justice and love, God is essentially saying, I want you to get rid of anything that isn't for justice and love. And that's why Rahab can be saved, because she was for justice and love. That's why you were able to make peace with other people. But if there were groups of people who said, no, we're not going to give up anything, well, then there's a problem, because these are people coming in to establish a kingdom that is meant to be all about justice and love. And if you can't fit in that, so now we start even getting into eschatology and salvation and justification and all this stuff. But I think it's a total reframing of it, and I think it fits with the text.
And I think that also you have this thing going on here, right? Like, just kind of more to your point. I think that understanding the ancient Canaanite world is pivotal too. Because it's not like people who are rooting for different sports teams, right? Like, I'm on Team Baal, I'm on Team Molech, I'm on Team Asherah, I'm on Team Yahweh, right? Like, it's not like, some teams are just like, it's Sox and Cubs, it's Cubs and Cardinals. Like, it's just kind of your preference, right? It's like all of these ancient religions, and you could argue that Yahwehism has some of this, so I don't want to say that the motives of the people of Yahweh were always pure. But all of these other ancient faith traditions, specifically Asherah, Baal, and Molech, these are religions that are founded, their foundational values are on violence, especially to vulnerable people, and the oppression of women.
Yeah.
So at the Baal Asherite culture, right, of the bull or the Asherah pole, this is about ritual rain. Like that, this is the primary method of worship in that culture is ritual rain of children. And the primary method of worship in Molech worship is ritual child sacrifice. So when you when you understand that these are the cultures that they're trying to overthrow, I think that you have a clearer understanding of, even if you do read it in kind of the most plain-faced reading of they destroyed everyone, the question is, who are the people who are like, so I've heard it said that when you read it that way, you have to ask the question of, were the mothers of these children praying for their own demise? Like, were the mothers saying, it would be better for a foreign army to kill all of us than for me to have another child who's going to be born into this horror? And when you think about it as the God answering the prayers of the Canaanite women, that is a totally radically different way of viewing. Even if you view the plain-faced reading, viewing it as God's answering the prayers of the Canaanite women by overthrowing the government by any means necessary.
So it's sort of like, yeah, it's like freeing Auschwitz, and unfortunately you're going to have to kill the soldiers along the way who won't allow you to free the people in the gas chambers. Like Hitler literally won't let you free the people unless you kill him. Like,
well, and here's the thing about you talk about it, the Holocaust is an excellent example. If you ask the people that were in those concentration camps, would it have been better if they could not have freed you with ground forces to just drop a bomb on Auschwitz? They are uniformly, they say yes. They say it would have been better to destroy that place. If we could not be saved, it would have been better to destroy that place utterly, including us. Because the horrors that were inflicted, we didn't want those horrors to be inflicted on the next generation. And I think that is a very clear, I mean, when you have no good options, right? And now I always say that's where Jesus comes and Jesus makes a way, right? But if you look at this from the perspective of, if you cannot overthrow these cultures, then what you're talking about is another 1,000 years of children being burned alive, another 1,000 years of ritual rape, and child sacrifice and abuse. That to me, I don't know the answer. I just know that we must view it, and also we have to view the story of Jonah in that way as well, which we can get to another time. But understanding that Jonah, we are all Jonah in that moment. That the story of Jonah is the most radical reversal in Scripture, and we are all Jonah. So
I think that's a choice. When you know there's a genocide going on, do you take action or do you not? And I think that could be closer to the situation that Joshua was facing. So I think people have gotten a different view, hopefully, or some sort of little nugget that at least challenges how they can view this book and the conquest. But again, I think it becomes clear that God is on the side of the one without the power yet again. God is again on the side of justice and love. And to turn the story around and say, no, this is a genocidal God, I think is to miss all that context anyway. So
yeah. And I think the one interpretation that I'm most uncomfortable with, to be honest, is the interpretation that uses Joshua as a justification for modern Israeli conquest.
And it just doesn't fit at all. It doesn't fit at all.
It doesn't fit at all. The idea that, well, this is their land, God gave it to them. I think that's a wildly misunderstood and oversimplified. Really, most of the, I think that's actually a distraction, right? This is when we talk about the devil as the presence of deception, which different people have different theologies surrounding Satan and all that, and that would be an interesting question for Stump the Pastor. But when you think about diversion or misdirection as the primary work of evil in the world, trading what's good for what's bad, I think oftentimes we say that Israel is justified in its current occupation of Palestinian land because of Joshua, when in reality most people who subscribe wholesale to that ideology are doing so because of their interpretation of Revelation, not because of their interpretation of Joshua.
And Revelation has
but
nothing to do with the land of Israel. So,
of course it doesn't. But it's much easier to try and justify by some sort of ancient land ownership real estate transaction that occurred between God and Israel. It's much easier to do that than to deal with the actual, no, I'm just trying to check the boxes so that Jesus comes back, right? And that's ultimately, that is, I think, what most of the Zionism is about. It's really about revelation and trying to force God's hand in the story of humankind, not about any sort of justice.
Well, and furthering the kingdom by violence just doesn't even make any sense. I mean, in Palestine, I mean, look at Don's article, right? I mean, Christians were thrown out of their homes in the name of God's kingdom. That is just so, it's so illogical and so anti-biblical and anti-God of, oh yeah, well, we had to kick out all those Christians and make them homeless and destitute so that God's kingdom could come. I just don't understand how on any level that can be defended.
Well, I think that people, I think it's much like the Black Lives Matter movement in that, or the movement against or in response to police violence or police brutality. I think that most of the issues that present themselves with Israel is a supreme lack of understanding of what's going on. It's not a hatred of the Palestinian people in the same way that people who talk about the Black Lives Matter movement as, well, why don't I've never had a bad interaction with the police. It's like, oh, well, yeah, you live in the suburbs. The police are great in the suburbs. In fact, what we want on the inner city is for the police in the inner city to police like they're in the suburbs. If we had suburban police in the inner city, we probably wouldn't have an issue, right? Like these things don't generally happen in the suburbs. These things happen in the city because we have a different ideology in the city of a militarized zone, and there's this war, gangland, and wars and all this stuff. But this is the same with Israel. Most people that I talk to are supremely unaware. When we had the conversation at Hope, I think you remember, Phil, and we had Andrew Larson come and do his make hummus not war and walls and all of this. We had people who were in their 70s and 80s sitting there going, "Why have I never been told about this? What like this isn't like, it wasn't like they weren't like, this isn't happening. They were like, obviously this is happening. I mean, it's so clear that it's happening. Why does nobody talk about, when they talk about Israeli settlement, why does nobody explain what an Israeli settlement is? And I think that really is the heart of the issue, that most of our issues within culture can be chalked up to ignorance.
Yeah. No, and I can tell you, I mean, I've been to Tekoa. I lived in Israel and went to Palestine and saw the settlements where water was cut off from the Palestinian side. And it wasn't because they were the Citadel militants trying to kill everyone. They're just families trying to survive. And I think when people can see that, my hope at least would be a reframing of understanding the issue that's going on.
Totally.
So, well, I think that it was a good conversation and enough for people to chew on for today, I would imagine. We didn't have any questions in the comments today, so if anything does come up for people on this topic or otherwise, Jon set up a big text box on our website right on the main page where you can submit a question anonymously. You can drop a question in the comments. Even if you're not watching this live, we'll get a notification and see it, and that'll help us as we go forward with next week. Any final words, Jon?
Perhaps, why are you such a bad pastor? I'm looking for some trolls, right? Get trolls. You ever seen those like vines where people like burn me?
Yeah.
Just come on, like, where are my trolls coming after us, questioning all of the things that we're talking about? No, I think that if you take anything away from today, to me it would be that so many of us feel as though we have a corner on scriptural interpretation. And the thing that you learn in seminary, Phil, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and this will be my final word of the day. You go into seminary going, I got to tick, at least I did, I got to tick this box in order to be equipped and empowered to do the work of ministry. And you leave, if you went to a good seminary, you leave going, I don't know anything about the Bible. Everything I thought I knew, there's 36 opinions about, and it's complicated. It's overcomplicated. So if you feel like you really understand Scripture, I encourage you to go get any sort of degree, advanced degree in the study of the Bible. Because Joshua, if you feel like I've taken liberties with the text in Joshua, or Phil's taken liberties with the text in Joshua here, this is the tip of the iceberg. So, that I like to tell people that because I don't want people to feel like we're going off the deep end here. This is what we are taught to do. And by the way, this is in the rabbinical tradition of Jesus to do exactly what we're doing here. So I appreciate you, Phil.
You too, man. Well, hey, just one final word on that. I think it's more humbling, and I think it requires more trust in God, that we don't have all the answers. We don't get to just land somewhere. It's a continual journey, and I think you'll get a lot more beauty, joy, and truth out of that way than just settling. So,
and you know what? Connection with God, that's the ultimate goal of Scripture. And so I'm going to do a plug right here you can subscribe at ruaspace.com to learn how to connect with God in a practical way.
Thanks, man.
All the mess.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you as always. Love you guys. Appreciate you, John. Appreciate all your guys' questions. We'll see you all next Saturday.
See you guys.
Grace and peace.